So we're kind of picking up on part two of integrating and funding renewables. We're going to do a real quick recap. We really do not lack the technology. We lack the implementation of the technology. One of the biggest things is large scale energy storage, pumped storage. Know what that is for your test. Of course, batteries. Know what compressed air storage is for your test. Know what hydrogen fuel cells would be. All right. So those are the energy storage technologies that will really allow us to integrate a lot more of the renewables into our grid. Um, those are the ones that we've just talked about. Hot and cold and flywheel also stored as a temperature or kinetic energy. How much can we produce versus the amount that is economically viable? If you are not comfortable with the total available resource, the technical potential, the practical potential, and the economic potential, make darn sure that by test time you've got those down. You may even see a multiple choice question that is not in that you do not have notes for related to this subject. All right. But I will reassure you, all of the no notes are multiple choice. All right. Um, can we afford it? The real costs of energy in reality for new power facilities that are put in, utility scale solar is the cheapest, and onshore wind is the next cheapest. Natural gas is the cheapest fossil fuel. All right. Um, Now, at our current rate, we're going to have about 60 years or less of natural gas. So when we say cheapest, if the laws of supply and demand continue, then as the supply of natural gas diminishes and the demand for natural gas increases because it begins to take the job of oil, then we see that price go up. It wouldn't surprise me if within the next 15 to 20 years, nuclear is actually considered cheaper than any of the fossil fuels. Okay? Coal is the only fossil fuel that we have more than 100 years worth of energy at our expected usage. And if you notice from chapter 12, even China has peaked in its coal usage. In other words, every country in the entire world is reducing the amount of coal that they are consuming. The factors that are driving these trends are very, very important. Know these, of course, but economically, the newest driver, and I believe that this is new information. Yep. So this is the first slide that's directly talking about chapter 12. So new information here that you haven't gotten any notes from me and lecture from me on. Why? Why, oh, why is the rate of renewable energy going up so much more? Well, to start with, is it going up so much more? Yes, it is. Guys, the total capacity of solar in the United States, 20% of it was installed just last year. So there's 20% of all of the solar capacity in the country was installed in 1 year, last year. We've been installing solar since, well, you don't know yet, we haven't covered the solar chapter, but since the 50s, 1954, Bell Laboratories got a commercial solar. So it's been a very slow growth from the 50s into the 70s. In the 70s, we had an oil crisis, and suddenly we created National Renewable Energy Laboratories. We had a law called PURPA, and those laws began to grow solar pretty quickly, along with many other renewable energy sources. But really, the technology, it took 20 years to grow up. I mean, you guys took 20 years to grow up, so why would technology just mature overnight? So from the 70s until the 90s, it was all hippies and experiments and science and commercial specific applications, like for space. We just didn't have a cord long enough to power the International Space Station. So we had to do something more modern. That technology, that expensive investment into that technology turned into reliable solar power in the 90s, but it was still very expensive. It took 20 years of manufacturing growth of that mature technology to get the costs to become competitive with fossil fuel. So from the 90s until the 2010s, But that's when we really saw it happen, guys. I entered this industry in 2010. We've had a 70% reduction in material costs in the last decade. So the new driver is that utility scale PV and onshore wind are the cheapest new renewable or the cheapest new energy sources that we have. Period. Now, the next driving factor is that we have a finite reserve of fossil fuels. We identified it in that last slide. Maybe 30 years worth of oil, maybe 60 years worth of natural gas, and maybe 100 years worth of coal. Now, you guys might not think of it. One of you in this room statistically is probably going to be here to see even the end of coal. Like, I might not get to see the end of coal, but the reality is that you could live 100 years more. There are people that live to be 120 years old, especially with the increasing health technologies. It would not surprise me at all if you guys see the headline in your lifetime, the world's last coal-powered electric production plant is shuttered. Boy, I look forward to that. You guys are definitely going to see the time when there are no more gasoline-powered cars on the road. I mean, that's just going to happen. There's no way around it. Yeah.
Our coal plants are shut down. We'd be able to power electric cars on the side or something.
Well, I mean, obviously we have to replace the loss of electric produced by coal with electric produced by another means. In fact, we have to produce more electricity because you think that of the transportation industry takes like 50% of our total energy. Well, when we electrify that transportation, which we're going to talk about here in just a couple minutes, that means that our total electric production has got to go up significantly over the next 20, 30, 40 years. So where does that extra production come from? Well, it's definitely not going to be coal. The United States is not building any new coal-fired power plants, but we are building new natural gas-fired electric power production facilities. So as the coal plants get shut down, one of two things happens. Either they are decommissioned, completely destroyed, or they are turned into natural gas-fired power plants. If they're turned into natural gas-fired power plants, basically it's just a repower is what they call it. If they're torn down, they already have the infrastructure for transmission, power distribution. More than likely, you're going to see renewable energy production go into those locations. In other words, in the surrounding farms around the coal-powered plant that closed down, you're going to see solar and wind farms. They're going to tie into those transmission lines because it's cheaper to develop around the existing infrastructure than to build all new infrastructure. All right. So as our finite reserves of fossil fuels deplete, we have to replace that with cheap energy. Nobody's going to spend more money to build a new coal-fired power plant than they could spend less money and build a new solar-powered power plant. You might be like, well, no, but we need coal because it'll produce power 24 hours a day. Well, guys, it's still cheaper to put solar power and energy storage in than it is to put a new coal-fired power plant in and pay for the coal over the next 50 years of running that power plant. So there's no doubt about it, and we'll see in our energy outlooks and our energy scenarios that the cheapest way for growth is the renewable energy. The next driving factor is reducing the greenhouse gas emissions globally and local air pollution. Do you personally care how polluted the air in Beijing is? Does it affect you?
I care, but
Right. It's not going to affect you. And as far as caring, it is way down on that list. You're going to stop and help a turtle cross the road locally before you send money to China to clean up China's air. Okay. So this term local is a really, really powerful thing. All right. Now, we, as in local, we have a tiny voice. Our voice is minuscule because of A, our population, and B, our economic position in the world. We are still some of the cheapest land and cheapest places to live in the United States is this southwest Missouri corner. We don't have a big voting block, either statewide or national wide. Really, the few voices that are powerful in our region are corporate voices. What corporate voices are large in our region of the United States? Tamco, so there's a roofing company. Yeah, that could be a reasonably large voice. CFI, very, very large trucking companies. Do you think if we could convince CFI to completely transform their fleet to electric, that that would have an impact? Hell yeah, it would have an impact. It'd have a huge impact. What other companies do we have in our area that have a large corporate or economic voice? Who's the largest non government employer in the entire world? Nope. Walmart. Walmart. They employ like 1.6 million people. Think if Walmart had an incentive that every employee got free financing for renewably powering their home. That'd be like 500,000 to 1,000,000 households immediately putting solar on their home or buying green energy in one fashion or another. Okay. How about food production? Do we have any large food production companies in our region? Tyson, how large are they? How about George's? Between Tyson and George's, I think they are the top two largest food producing companies in the world. Not just in the United States, in the world. What if they said we are going to commit that all of our food production facilities, like every chicken house, has to have renewable energy that powers them, or we're not going to contract with you. What people think is, oh, that's going to raise my price of chickens. Price of chickens is going to go through the roof. Hold on a minute. If solar is cheaper than natural gas or propane or coal, and we're looking at the long-term picture, don't you think Tyson would actually be able to produce their chicken cheaper in the long term? There you go. The farmers just need an avenue. They need an incentive to say, yes, the people that buy my chickens are on board with this, so I want to get on board with this. So we might not think that we have a big political voice, but guys, we happen to be in an area that we have a tremendous corporate voice. Go to work for the companies. Okay. Do you think that Walmart has a solar division? Yes, absolutely, guys. Absolutely, they have a solar division. But we're small minded. We don't realize that this stuff is happening everywhere, behind back doors. In front of the public. I think Walmart has had 11 stores burn from solar panels on the roof catching fire. I think almost every Walmart in the state of New York is powered by solar. Yeah. Okay. We just don't realize that the big guys already recognize that solar is cheaper. The reason they're not promoting it is because they're investing in it. They want to own the companies that are going to make the money on it when everybody realizes yesterday would have been a great time to get into solar, but today the prices have gone back up. My honest opinion is we are rock bottom. The price of solar, both residential and utility commercial, it will never be cheaper than now. We have a labor shortage. We have a skills gap shortage. We have a pandemic that we're dealing with. And so a few years from now, you won't be able to buy solar for $2.25 per watt like my company would install it, or even $1 per watt like a utility scale system will be, because all of those things I just talked about. Number one, supply and demand. Number two, the cost of labor. Number three, inflation. Everything gets more expensive in time. So this local air pollution is something that we don't really deal with here, but large cities and foreign countries, they are the ones that are really going to be pushed by local air pollution concerns. I lived in Denver. Let me rephrase that. I owned a business and lived in Colorado Springs in 2006. And as I looked towards Denver, there was always a cloud over the city. You could tell which direction Denver was by just looking around. Oh, yep, brown clouds that way. There's the city. I moved back to Denver in 2014. Lived there for a year. In that 12 years, the cloud was gone. There was no dark cloud over the city of Denver anymore. Look at the pictures of air pollution from the 70s, then the 80s, then the 90s, then the 2000s. In the United States, we have made a huge reduction in our local air pollution. All right. The foreign countries, especially China and India, have a long way to go with those. So the next is the need to meet the growing demand in developing nations. Remember those countries we just talked about. How many people live in India? 1.5 billion or something like that. How many people live in China? Over a billion people like that. So we're talking 2.5 billion people simply in two countries. Do you think that they have a high standard of living? No, they have a pretty low standard of living. Yeah, I mean, a very, very low wage. But if you have that many people and their standard of living increases even a tiny amount, let's say the population on average used 2% more electricity this year than it did last year. That'd be more energy than the entire country of the United States would use because they have 2.5 billion, we have 350 million, and even though we use a lot more per person, that 2% per person increase multiplied by 2.5 billion people is tremendous. And so they are going to have a huge demand and an economic appetite or an economic ability to pay for it because it's gotten cheaper. Even individual systems. Your own little shanty in India can now afford to have a solar panel that charges your cell phone because having access to that cell phone allows you to sell goods on an international market, and your handmade beads can now support the price of paying for that solar panel. The world's changing due to the internet. Many of those countries that would never have had internet connections in the past now have cellular internet. They couldn't have afforded to put the infrastructure in for all the wiring, but cell service works amazing, And when you guys get rid of your old phones, you probably don't realize it, but they go to those third world countries and they get sold and reused until they physically break. They use our old cellular technology for a long time now. Recycling. Yes. Yes, that's exactly right. So next, concerns about nuclear and fossil fuel safety and health effects. 20 years, 30 years ago, people thought nuclear was our future. Like, hey, when fossil fuels run out, nuclear is what we're going to do, And you guys heard of this saying called NIMBY? Not in my backyard. It's an acronym. How many of you guys wouldn't mind a nuclear facility put in somewhere within 5 miles of the ocean? I don't know if I really like that idea. Would it bring economic growth? Heck yeah. Would it bring high-paying jobs? Shoot yeah. Would it mean, an influx of people that are smart and want to spend money and entertainment? Yes. Does it mean I'd move away? Probably. Okay. Not in my backyard. Nobody wants a nuclear facility in their backyard. Period. All right. And so once we had like the 3 Mile Island event in the early 80s or late 70s, I believe it was, early 80s, which was nearly a nuclear meltdown in the United States. It was caused by a valve being put in backwards where it said on, it was actually off. That's all it was. Okay. So they thought that the pipes were pumping to cool it, but that valve was off. Finally, some old dude that said, I'm going to die anyway, just came in and started turning valves. And it got cool and he realized, hey, this valve was installed backwards. Something that simple on a nuclear power plant could kill millions of people or literally condemn an entire region. Look at Chernobyl. Chernobyl was an actual meltdown in Russia. I mean, they're still like every year you'll see articles about this new animal was discovered around Chernobyl. Okay. The last one, I love mushrooms. The last one is that they have found a mushroom that eats nuclear radiation. It adapted there. Like, you might kill half of us, But if one of us adapts and overcomes, hell, radiation got nothing on me. I can handle it, you know. So I really don't want that concept of evolution forced by radiation in the region where I would live. So we also do recognize that the health effects of fossil fuels add up. The particulate matter, the smell from that diesel truck, that's not good for us. And it doesn't matter if it takes a few days or a few weeks off of our life. We're actually looking at the economics of it. The medical costs to treat the emphysema, the COPD, the chronic bronchitis, the asthma attacks, let alone loss of production of people who miss work because of all those conditions. And last but not least is the reliability and remote power needs, even extraterrestrial needs. You guys hear any SpaceX news from this last week? No? So SpaceX sent the first true commercial astronauts to space. In other words, everybody that has gone before these four people have either been like billionaires who like they own the company, Richard Branson, Jeff Bezos, or they are scientists that are studying something in space. But SpaceX, for the first time, sent four people. They spent 3 days in space. They actually went farther out, like twice as far out as the International Space Station. They made, I think, 12 orbits per day and for 3 days. So they made like 36 trips around the Earth while they were there. Yeah, taking pictures and with selfies. There's a Netflix documentary going to come out about it. So, yeah. I don't know. It's very private, secretive. It's Elon Musk. So, yeah. Correct. But we need power on these remote locations. When we cover solar PV, you guys are going to be astonished to know that we are already designing, and China has already funded a space array of solar panels. In other words, a giant array in space that will collect the power and then beam that power back down to Earth.
Yeah, don't they do that?
Microwaves.
Oh.
So, weaponizing these systems is something we'll discuss when we get to that chapter. Okay?
This is why China
It's a hot topic, right? Okay. So, all of these remote needs, Antarctica, the North Pole, okay, Ashanti in Mexico, okay, they are A, being able to afford it because it's gotten cheaper, and B, getting the technology that it lasts a long time. So, energy scenario. An energy scenario is kind of our future production and use of energy. Please be familiar with what an energy scenario is. It's not really a prediction, a projection, or a vision. Okay? If you use the word prediction on a quiz, I'll let you slide. If you use it on a test, I might have to count it wrong, depending on what else that you said. Okay? I'm predicting the weather tomorrow if I'm a meteorologist. Okay? I am projecting a revenue for my company for next year. Okay? They kind of work similar. I'm not going to spend time on the semantics of the difference between them, but a vision is what we are more looking for here. So, specifically, it is a vision of future energy use and production by each type. In other words, you just can't say, my vision is we're going to use less energy because we're more efficient in the future. No. How much fossil fuels are we going to produce? And how much are we going to consume? Don't we just consume the same amount that we produce? No, absolutely not. And why would the production versus the consumption make a real difference? The cost. If you have a high supply, then you're going to have a lower cost of those goods. That's why we have oil cartels like OPEC. It would be totally against the law in the United States. But internationally, they're like, what are you going to do? Nuke us? You need our oil. Okay, so we're all going to get together and we're all going to agree that we're going to produce less and charge more so we can make more profits over it. That's the reason that oil was like $10 a barrel in the 90s and now it's $60, $70 per barrel. It's not because we produce less oil, guys. We actually produce more oil now than we do in the 90s. The difference is we've built this expectation of price and we've built the demand for these goods up to where now somebody's willing to pay that much for the oil. So each individual type is very, very important because it allows investors to predict where to invest their money. We're going to talk more about that also. One of the keys in your definition or your explanation is it must be detailed. We have to have a detailed vision. All right. And when I say details, I don't just mean details about our production or use. I also mean detailed prediction about the driving factors of that production and use, like government policy. Like in a Greenpeace energy scenario, they would look at what happens if we can get the government to stop subsidizing fossil fuels immediately. Well, there's some very negative impacts that they will identify on the economy. That there's some really positive impacts that they would identify on the environment. And so they would have to spend, I don't mean a few hours, guys. This isn't like a college 24-page report. Has anybody ever looked at an energy scenario? No? Yeah, there's a few examples that are modern that we're going to click on here in just a couple minutes. I mean, we're talking hundreds of pages. You know, I'm a dork. I love looking at this stuff. I don't even actually look at the reports. They're too in-depth. I look at the summaries by professionals who were paid to look at all that and create the summary. Even the summaries sometimes are like 25 pages in length. Okay. So in the detail, they normally identify one of two things, either a BAU, which stands for business as usual. In other words, we're not going to change our government incentives. We're not going to change our company policies. We're just going to see how the economic factors and the current rules play out. Okay? Do any of you think that going forward with the current administration and the current leaders throughout the world, that we are going to have a business as usual scenario in the future? Yeah, we're not. I mean, there you go. And that's just it. We're always going to have change, but the rate of that change is fairly predictable on many things. But we have a confluence. In other words, we have the United Nations who is saying we need this rapid change. We have the European Union that we're saying we need this rapid change. Now we have an American government political administration, the Biden administration, that is also saying we need this change. And that's not to say that 4 years from now a different person will get in, but you don't just get to flip a switch. You know, these policies that they put in, the funding that they get put in, we are still fighting over Obamacare like 15 years later. So it's not like it just goes away from a new administration. The rate of change, as he said, just slows down. But we have a confluence right now. And that confluence means that it's very, very, very unlikely that we will not get significant changes in government policy and support to increase the rate of growth of renewables. All right. So who does these? Large global organizations. I did not list OPEC, but OPEC will. Why do you think I wouldn't list OPEC? What is OPEC? I don't think political. Anybody tell me what OPEC stands for? That's the nations, the Middle Eastern nations. It's oil producing countries. Okay. There we go. Okay. Oil, I think it stands for like oil producing economic consortium or economic conglomerate or something like that. In other words, a group of countries and companies that have come together to say we're all going to agree to these rules to raise the prices of oil. I didn't put OPEC in there because they have nothing to do with renewable energy. They won't even examine renewable energy growth when they're examining their world energy outlooks. And obviously they are being funded by organizations that want investors to believe that the future of oil is great. Last year, 2020, was the first time that even OPEC identified that fossil fuels are going to be reducing in both production and consumption by the end of this decade. Even the oil companies admit that. All right. So we're going to click on one of these and see what it brings us to. This is the IEA, International Energy Agency's 2020 World Energy Outlook. If you would like to buy the report, you can. It's relatively expensive, but if you were a large energy company or a large energy investor, it'd probably be worth it to you. But here is the breakdown, and you guys can't see this. I'm sorry. Yeah. So if you want to buy the report, you can. Click right here and buy it. But there is a breakdown of different aspects of it. So just the review.
Costs $43.
No, it's pretty free, but you can tell how long just the review is, or the overview. Yeah. Yeah. So obviously, it's some thorough information. When you guys take my more advanced classes, you will be expected to give me some reports on these overviews. I want you, as an industry expert, to not know what today is going to happen, but to be able to accurately expect what the future is going to happen. So let's look at what they say. And it identifies, COVID-19 as a significant impact. Our assessment is that global energy demand is set to drop by 5% in 2020. Energy-related CO2 emissions are going to drop by 7%, and energy investment by 18%. The impacts vary by fuel. The estimated falls of 8% in oil demand and 7% in coal use stand in sharp contrast to a slight rise in the contribution of renewables. The reduction in natural gas demand is around 3%, while global electricity demand looks set to be down by a relatively modest 2% for the year. And so make a mental note of that, because I'm going to ask you some questions on this in a couple minutes over your thoughts for energy use. But let's go and see if we can find what we can find about solar and renewables. Notice the demand for emissions and investment indicators. Renewables are the only energy source that is expected to be increased in demand. All of the other, including the total energy, is reducing. Somewhere in here, we'll get to predictions for solar growth. There we go. Solar electricity becomes the new king. Renewables grow rapidly in all of our scenarios, with solar at the center of this new constellation of electricity generation technologies. Supportive policies and maturing technologies are enabling very cheap access to capital in leading markets. With sharp cost reductions over the past decade, solar PV is consistently cheaper than new coal or gas-fired power plants in most countries. And solar projects now offer some of the lowest cost electricity ever seen. In the steps, renewables meet 80% of the growth in global electricity demand to 2030. In other words, all new electric energy production growth between when this was produced and the next decade, 80% of that growth is going to come from solar. That's where the growth is going to be, guys. According to the World Energy Outlook from the International Energy Association. It goes on to say hydropower remains the largest renewable source of electricity, but solar is the main driver of growth. Each year after 2022, followed by onshore and offshore wind. Some contribution of nuclear is expected. All right, we're going to go on. I'm going to close this one down and come back, and we're going to look at the International Renewable Energy Agency. This is the IRENA. Okay, this is their report, and this actually came out this summer. Come on, man. Yep. Yep. So that was a World Energy Outlook scenario that they designed with the goal of producing 66% of all of our energy from renewables by a certain year. We have definitely stepped up the rate of which we are meeting that. Almost every scenario that we felt that we would try to meet before, we've realized we will need to meet more aggressive numbers quicker, or we won't meet our sea level rise targets. That's what it kind of comes down to. That report is outdated. This one that I've given you, the 2020 IEA, is the current one. I think that one was based off the 2016 report, and this book was like 2017 or 18 is when it was put together. They did one in 2018. They did another one in 2020. Yeah, every 2 years is the IEA, I believe. Yeah. So, all right. So here is IRENA's World Energy Transition Outlook for a 1.5 degrees Celsius pathway. Remember how we talked about that 66? Their goal is to keep our temperature from rising above a certain amount. And they turn that into, we need to meet these targets in order to do that.
I think they said it was 2 Celsius.
Right. Right. And so to look at this is basically saying you can download this report, I believe, for free. Okay. But basically their goal is driven based on climate change. And a lot of investors don't want to invest based on climate change driven. They want to based on economic driven data. And that's why they use the IEA, because it is not biased towards renewable energy. That's also the reason that most people don't use OPEC, because it's biased towards fossil fuels. Guys, nobody's biased. Every human being has a filter, and everything that we perceive is perceived through our filter. There's no way around that. That's why you want to get a well-rounded view by looking at multiples of these reports before you go create a $500 million investment for somebody, because if you didn't take all of it into account, then it's not going to be an accurate investment piece of information. So Greenpeace is the last, and they are also a fairly environmentally motivated organization. Here's the great thing about Greenpeace. They are not politically motivated. A lot of people think they are. No, they do not donate to any political party. I worked for Greenpeace for a while, and they will not accept donations from any corporations, period. They will not accept donations from political parties. They work very hard to remain independent of politics, but they are extremely environmentally driven. Green peace. Pretty simple. Okay. All right. Any questions over our... Pardon?
Any organization
Who what? What about them?
They would not accept donations from
corporations. They will not accept donations from corporations or political organizations. Yep. Okay.
But if I donated to them before I ran for president, then it's
because then you're not doing it for political.
Yep.
You are doing it just because.
Yep. Costs of growth, guys. There's a TV show out there. It's The Handmaid's Tale, I believe it's called. Anybody seen that or read the book? Watch the first episode. There's a saying in there. It's along the lines of um, growth and change is not always good for every person. Okay, improvement does not always mean better for everyone. Okay, and that's part of what the renewable energy industry wants to sweep under the rug. What happens to the coal miners? They get put out of jobs. Okay, what happens to their communities that the main source of income was those coal mines? Like, correct, poverty. You know, towns go under. You know, fail. Sure, sure. So let me ask you this though: is it the government's job to pick winners and losers in industry? No. I mean, not in our government. We're not a socialist government. We're a capitalist government. And so, as much as I would love to go and say, yeah, we absolutely have to solve the problem for those coal miners, you know, in 2008, our government bailed out our banks. Our government bailed out our auto industry. My business closed down. You know, I had quite a few families that worked for me that lost their jobs. And so we need consistency. I'm not going to support one plan or the other, but we need consistency. All right. There is good solutions to these negative impacts if we plan properly. Re-education is one of those. You know, those coal miners, they can be solar installers. It's not like it's rocket science. We're not going to turn all those people into computer programmers, though. You know, and so early retirement. That's one of the things that we often don't necessarily talk about for these people in industry. You know, I'm 42 years old. I still feel I'm young enough that I could get retrained for a new industry and enter and have a career in that industry. But if I was 55 years old, the last thing in my brain would be, you know, I'm going to start climbing up on roofs. I'm going to get retrained and I'm going to have a whole second, maybe third career. And so an option where these people who had a career throughout their life can get a gap filled for a few years until their retirement and their pension would actually kick in, it is one of those options besides re-education and retraining. You know? But there's costs of growth. Let's start with capital costs. The cost to borrow the money to build the project. Shockingly, that's one of the most expensive costs of any project, guys. Let's look at a real estate development project. If you're going to borrow, let's say, $300,000 and you're going to build an apartment complex, okay, the interest on that $300,000 is going to cost you about $1,200 per month. The monthly payment to pay that apartment complex off over 30 years is only going to cost you about $500 per month for a total monthly payment of $1,700 per month for my apartment complex that cost me $300,000. That means that of the $1,700 that I'm making a payment for, the vast majority of it is the capital cost. If the government would have come in and said, Andrew, we will loan you the $300,000 to build this apartment complex. We're not going to charge you any interest. Just make a $500 a month payment to us for the next 30 years and you'll have paid it off. Wow, I could charge a whole lot less rent to the renters in the apartment complex, couldn't I? All right. It's the same thing with the capital costs of renewable energy. We just spent $6 billion with a B, $billion on wind turbines about 50 miles north of here. Somebody had to come up with the $6 billion to invest. If you had $6 billion, how much are you willing to loan your $6 billion to somebody for?
I would say
So, interest rates is what we look at. And every year, you're going to want more money back than what you spent. Okay, that we expect interest on our investments. Remember when I told you that $1,200 off of $300,000? $1,200 was interest, you know, every month. That was at like 4 to 4.5% interest. In the energy industry, even the most mature technologies are going to be probably between 4 and 6% interest. Nobody gives up their $1 billion for a low interest rate. In fact, guys, I personally don't invest with anything less than a 10% interest rate, a 10% return on investment. So if I was that billionaire and I loaned your company $6 billion, I'm going to expect you to pay me $600 million in interest every year. And that's before you ever begin to pay me back my $6 billion. Okay. That's a lot of electricity you're going to have to sell to make $600 million. All right. So when we get to the high risk investments, let's say a new hydroelectric dam. You know, if that thing fails, there's a lot of people dying. That's a high risk investment. You know, an investor might want 10% investment, 10% interest or return on investment for that project. The next is, I want my money back in a reasonable time. What's the longest loan terms that you ever hear of? 30 years? Yeah, even student loans are probably not much more than 30 years, but you get deferments and all these things that make it pretty much life sentence.
As long as you're taking school.
Right. But 30-year home loan is about it. Most people who are investing in energy projects, they will only loan for the length of the warranty of the equipment, which 20 or 25-year warranty is all that the solar panels have a warranty for. And so besides paying this system off and the interest for it, I need to pay the whole thing off in 20 years. So these capital costs are some of the largest costs involved with building new renewable energy projects. Why? Because the cost of renewable energy is almost all up front. If you build a coal-fired power plant, you're not borrowing the money to buy the coal, but the coal will be the largest cost in that whole project. You only had to borrow the money to build the facility. That's a tiny cost in the whole project. Whereas with a solar field, the vast majority of the cost is the building of the solar panels, the buying of the land. Those are all upfront costs, which means very high capital costs.
I feel like that's what gets everyone for renewable energy is that all of it's upfront.
Sure.
Immediate.
Sure.
Everyone's scared of it.
So what happens is the wealthy end up getting wealthier because they are the only ones that can really afford to invest all that money up front. It's the way that the incentives are set up. It's the fact that they can't benefit from the incentives if they aren't wealthy. So right now, if you go spend $10,000 on a solar electric system, you are not going to benefit from the tax credit because you don't make enough money to pay enough money to the federal government to owe the government taxes. I do. So I'm going to get my system literally 26% cheaper than you guys. Why? Because I have a large income and a large tax burden. So our incentives for this growth is incentivizing to where it's only an incentive for the people with money. It's not an incentive for the average homeowner that they have less than 2 months worth of savings in their bank account. There's just not a good financial incentive currently for those people. I'm going to say as good. There's not as good of a financial incentive for those people. If that kind of answers kind of what you were talking about. Yeah.
Electric cars, how, like, and they were gone for 50, 60 years, how would they dispose of that?
They recycle the batteries.
Yeah,
Yep.
Tesla,
100% of Tesla's car batteries are recycled.
That's what I thought.
Yep. Yep. So we're about to run out of time, guys. So let me real quick cover these. Land use is very high cost also, but realize as the cost of land rises, so does the cost of our solar projects. So arable land is land that can be farmed. Okay, if we begin to use our arable land, our farmland for energy production, what's that going to do to crop prices? What's it going to do to food production? which means now we have more starving people or people eating lower quality foods. That's the last thing I want for my country and the residents of my country. Okay. Maslow's hierarchy of needs. Yep. Yep. And then how can we divide these costs? Taxes and subsidies. Okay. Nearly all energy sources are subsidized by either federal, state, county, city, or public utilities in one way or another. Changing these disrupts the employment and the costs of consumer goods, whether it's the trucking companies. Okay. But wait a minute. What if we put an incentive, a government incentive for trucking companies to buy electric trucks? They could actually deliver your goods cheaper. So the cost of your individual goods would go down, but the cost of your taxes are going to go up because somebody has to pay the taxes to give the money to the government so that the money can give the government that subsidy to the car manufacturers or to the shipping company. One way or another, there is no such thing as a free lunch. It's not. Okay? Pay me now, pay me later. We have to invest for our growth. That's really what it comes down to. So, on our closing thoughts, the 100% renewable energy movement, who is driving it? It is not federal governments or country governments. It is cities, municipalities, and companies. That's the important thing I want you guys to grasp out of the 100% energy or the 100% renewable movement is everybody's like, oh, the government's forcing people to go renewable. No, they're not. There's no country in the world that the government is forcing people to go renewable energy. What they are doing is lower entities, people that local communities can elect, are saying, we have a goal and our city or our company or our community is going to produce 100% of its energy through renewable means. I refer to this as grassroots movements. Okay. How did and will the pandemic change energy use? I wish I had more time to get you guys' opinion, but did you catch that the pandemic dramatically reduced our energy use?
Yes.
So, where? Do you think that you used less vehicles? That's it. Excellent, Cameron. It's not at home. At your home, you used more energy. Okay? Correct. Electric use went up. Fossil fuel use went down. Okay? All right. So, how will electric power transportation change energy use? V to G. What's V to G? Vehicle to grid. Guys, I lost power at 11 o'clock last night. I didn't get coffee this morning. Maybe I'm grumpy because of that. I can't tell you how many times, like, I was saying cuss words like, freaking solar teacher, I don't got power. Okay, I'm sitting in the dark at 11:30 last night. It's going to come back on. It's going to come. No, it didn't come back on. Okay. So, no, luckily I have a well, so I was smart enough to like shut down the water so this morning I could still flush my toilet and everything like that. But I kept thinking, if I just had my Cybertruck, vehicle to grid charging, all it would have taken was, couple thousand electric vehicles in our grid hooked up to the grid. And even if the power got knocked out, we would have been able to power our own grid. Distributed generation is the future, and electric vehicles, V to G, is going to be a big part of that. Your personal use affects growth rates. Do you guys know that both Newmac and Liberty will allow you to buy green energy? You can call them and say, I want to buy solar power or wind power, and they will sell you blocks of renewable energy. Is it going to cost more? Yeah, but you can make that personal choice. The entire time I lived in Georgia, I bought green energy. Where I moved to right now, it's Newmac, and they didn't offer it whenever I first moved there. If I wasn't buying a new place with 91 acres, we would put solar where we're at right now. So, pardon? I think it's 18 cents per kilowatt hour is what they're charging versus like 12.9 cents for non-green. So about a third more. Yep. You'd be smarter if you're going to live there for a longer period of time to put your own in. But if you're an apartment complex, a lot of people say, I don't have a choice. I can't use solar power in an apartment. Yes, you can. I can't use wind power in an apartment. Yes, you can. It's just going to cost you a little bit more. Yep. And then personal investments. So I hope lots of you guys are already at your age planning for retirement. One of the easy ways to plan for retirement is to spend less money. So a lot of people, they let's say have a $200 a month electric bill. Okay, if you were to buy a solar system for your home and make a $200 per month payment, or let's say I actually pulled the money out of my retirement system to pay for this solar. Now I can take that $200 a month that I was spending on electric and put towards my retirement. Investment is a very fascinating concept. There's a board game right up here that is called Cash Flow. We are going to be playing that game this Friday at 10 o'clock. It is not required by any means, but if you are interested in learning investment, that is part of a book series called The Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Okay. And it's my favorite of all of the investment series books. And then last is how much should government policy drive the rate of growth? Again, I wish I had more time to hear opinions and hear thoughts out there, but it's something you really do need to form your opinion on because politics affects our economy, it affects our energy consumption, it affects our infrastructure. It's not necessarily should be the only reason that you vote a certain way or another way. But do you guys realize that there's actually a political party dedicated specifically to environmental issues? It's the Green Party. Okay, Jill Stein is actually the person who I personally voted for in the election between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. I didn't vote for either of them; they both sucked. Okay, but Jill Stein is who I voted for in that election. She was a Green Party member. Right? So there may be more options out there politically than you even recognize. So if you haven't thought about it, think about it because politics and government policies do affect our energy futures. Please do not forget to turn in your quiz 3 if you still had it.